there is something like an emergent ethic that's evident in biological systems. And one of the most outstanding examples of that, I would say, is apart from the work that Dewall has done with chimpanzees, showing the beginnings of an ethic, at least in the behavioral sense, the beginnings of an ethic among chimpanzees is work that's been done with rats. And so Jaak Panksepp, for example, who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which I would highly recommend. It's a real work of genius.
You blew my mind with Piaget, by the way, with the way that rats...
No, that's Panksepp. That
wasn't
Panksepp.
Piaget?
No, Piaget found that out in children. So Panksepp was the scientist who discovered that rats laugh.
That's right.
And you think, well, that's not a big deal. It's like, actually, it is a really big deal, because it shows commonality of the positive emotion systems across biological strata, essentially. So it's actually a really big deal. And he found that if you tickle rats with an eraser, they laugh ultrasonically.
Yeah.
And so you have to slow it down to hear them. And the reason he figured that out was because he was trying to figure out why, if you take rat pups away from their mother and feed them and give them enough water, they still die. So they die unless you massage them with, well, he used a pencil eraser. That's what, because it's kind of soft, it seems to work without harming the rats, little rat pups. And if you rub them with pencil eraser, then they'll thrive. And that was actually translated very rapidly into practical research, because it turns out that if you have a premature infant, it's in an incubator, they often lose weight, which is a really bad thing, because they're supposed to be gaining weight. But if you massage them 3 times a day for 10 minutes, then they'll gain weight about as fast as they do in utero, and they leave the hospital on average 5 days earlier, and the beneficial cognitive and physiological effects are still detectable 6 months down the road. It's a walloping effect. And so it turns out that one of the things Panksepp sorted out was that the touch is a human need. It's not a secondary need, it's a primary need, like food and water.
And childhood development.
Yeah. Well, and he was also a big proponent of rough and tumble play, because he found out that in rats, that rough and tumble play, especially among juvenile males, catalyzes prefrontal development, and that rat pups who are male that aren't allowed to engage in rough and tumble play show prefrontal hypodevelopment, and you can then treat them with Ritalin, which is the ADHD drug, just in case you're wondering. So that's a very dismal line of scientific research, but also very promising. So what Panksepp also found, and this is another piece of information that really blew me away when I first read about it, was Panksepp discovered the play circuitry in mammals, and that's also a big deal, right? That's like discovering a continent. To discover a dedicated circuitry to a set of complex biological functions, that's a big deal, man. And so when he was investigating play behavior among rats, he noticed that juvenile males in particular would work to wrestle. And they wrestle really a lot like, well, human children, or like human children and dogs wrestle, and rats pin each other. So what Panksepp found first was that, and other scientists as well, but I'll use him as a shorthand, was that rats would work to enter a play arena where they knew they were going to be allowed to wrestle with a peer. And that's kind of how you figure out if a rat wants to do something, right? You make him button press for it or pull on something, and then you can measure how fast he'll press the button or how hard he'll pull, and you can get some estimate of how motivated he is. And rats are pretty damn motivated to enter into a play arena. And so if one rat enters into a play arena and another rat does, and the one rat is 10% bigger than the other, then in like 9 out of 10 cases, the big rat can pin the little rat. And in the first bout, then pinning establishes dominance. This is kind of an interesting commentary on scientific methodology too, because let's say that you were investigating rat behavior and you were trying to draw conclusions, and you only paired rats together once. You'd assume the big rat dominates, its physical size that does the domination, and that's the purpose of play. But that isn't right, because play...
Gotta let it win every once in a while.
Well, play is something that iterates, right? You don't play with a person only once, you play with them, well, who knows for how long, right? If it's a relationship that lasts decades, then it's decades of reciprocal interaction. So Panksepp and his colleagues and the other scientists who were working on this paired the rats repeatedly. So these are iterated games. And the rules of an iterated game aren't the same as the rules of a one-off game. And that might actually be the basis for a universal ethic, is that there are rules for iterated games. And what Panksepp found was that, okay, so the big rat is now superordinate to the little rat. Now, when you repair them, the little rat has to ask the big rat to play. That's the rule. So the big rat gets to sit there like he's cool, and the little rat has to hop up like Like a dog that's asking you to play and sort of bounce around. You all know what that looks like. Dog kind of puts its rear end up in the air, kind of hops a little bit, and that means like, well, come on, human, cuff me, you know? And if you have any sense, you know how to do that. And you can even understand when a dog does it. And the dog, if he's socialized, can understand when you're doing it, right? Because a well-socialized dog is, you kind of go like this, and then he does the same thing, and you whack him on the side of the head a little bit, and he growls and puts his, you know, your hand in his mouth, but he doesn't bite it, but he sounds like he's going to. The dog knows what the hell's going on, unless it's raised by a behavioral psychologist, which is... Anyways, the worst behaved dog I ever saw was a dog that was raised by a behavioral psychologist. So anyway, sorry about that. But so anyway, so you pair these rats together, and what you find is that, so the little rat has to ask the big rat to play, and the big rat will, like, you know, break his cool and then wrestle. And then if you pair them repeatedly, unless the big rat lets the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat will no longer ask him to play. Like, and I read that, it was like, little electrical storm went off in my brain.
That is what happened to me too.
Well, it's so good, so absolutely unbelievable is that, well, there you have it, it's emergent ethic of reciprocity. Yeah. All you need to do is pair animals together in reciprocal play bouts, and you have an emergent reciprocity. And then you think, well, okay, so that's the basis for social interaction, is that reciprocity. There's a bit of an advantage to the big rat, but not a huge advantage. Say, well, that's the beginning of an ethic. And you say, well, human beings, that ethic emerged at the biological level, and then human beings watched it develop and told stories about it. That's where the stories came from. And then out of the stories, we coded an explicit ethic. And that's where the philosophy of ethics came from. But it emerged from the bottom up. Something Nietzsche predicted like 150 years ago. He said, well, you know, we'll find that there was an emergent ethic that emerged biologically and then was later mapped. And so that was just, well, that's just absolutely beyond belief. Yes. And then very likely true, and points the way to something like, well, an archetypal ethic, certainly one of reciprocity, which is I think, the fundamental archetypal ethic. It's like, well, here's another example.
Jordan, maybe just because we want to touch on a bunch of other points as well. But we're amazingly in depth in this. This is so cool.
Well, universal ethic is important, as it turns out.
Exactly.
Let me tell just a brief story.
Okay.
All right, because this is also extremely important because it shows where the classical economists are wrong.
Brief story.
Brief.
Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I know. It's not likely. So let's play a trading game. Okay, so you two can play this trading game. So here's the deal. It's very simple. I'm going to give you $100. I'm not, actually, but I'm going to give you $100, and you can offer some of it to your partner in the game. But the rule is if she says no, you don't get anything, and neither does she. And you only get to make one offer. So, okay, here's your $100. How much are you going to offer her? 40. Okay, would you take 40? Okay, now that's interesting.
Wow.
Okay, very good. That's perfect. Okay, so first of all, the classic economist would say you should offer her $1. Why? Well, because she might as well take $1 because she gets $1.
Yeah,
and you want to maximize your own return, so you get $99. It's like, what happens when you do that? What happens is that is never what people do. They usually offer approximately 50%.
Yeah.
And if they don't, then the other person refuses.
Yeah.
Now, then you might think, well, let's say you matched a rich person and a poor person, and you said, okay, give the rich person 100, and they offer the poor person $1. What does the poor person say? You think, well, yeah, I need the dollars. They say, no, go to hell. I'm not doing it. And they're more likely, the poor person is more likely to refuse the lower offer than a rich person is. Running completely contrary to the predictions of classical economists. You play that game across the world, it's pretty much 50-50. And that's so interesting because it's another example of that emergent ethic. It's like, well, part of the reason you'd say no, and why no is correct, is because you don't play one trading game. You play a lifetime of trading games. And the right answer to the question of how to play a lifetime of trading games is to not settle for less than 50%. But you could also make a case that if you're the giver rather than receiver, if you're playing an iterated game, you might want to offer $60. Because especially if your reputation is being broadcast. Because let's say your goal isn't to get $40, which is what you'd be left if you offered 60. Your goal is to let everybody know that if they play with you, you give them 60 and you get 40. And then what happens is like, well, let's take a vote on who wants to play with who. It's like, you want to play with the person who offers you 10, or do you want to play with the person who offers you 60? And then the person who's a little more generous than reciprocal, 50-50 would be reciprocal, maybe you should err on the side of generosity. Why? Well, easy. People will line up to play with you. So then the question is, do you want to win the game, or do you want to win the set of games? Right. And I think there's rules that govern the set of all possible games. And it's the rules that govern the set of all possible games that constitute something like an emergent ethic. So anyway, so that's a very useful thing to know. It's a very useful thing to know.
It is. So, can you give a couple quick ones of those potential universal ethics that govern the set of games?
Well, I think that's the big one. I think the big one is you approximate reciprocity, but it would be better. It'd be better if you can figure out how to. I think it's reciprocity with erring on the side of generosity, because there's just no downside to that in an iterated game. It's like, I'm going to borrow. What I do when I grade papers with students, for example, is I grade them and then I add 5%. It's like, well, maybe I made a mistake, so I'll err on the side of generosity, right? And why not do that in your reciprocal interactions? That doesn't mean you're letting people take advantage of you, right? It's not a matter of weakness in your negotiating strategy, because there's no excuse for that. That's a losing game, that. But if you could take 50% or 70% and you decide to be generous, it's like, well, you still have to be awake so that you're not being messed about with by people who are a little bit on the psychopathic end. You don't want to be foolish about it. But reciprocal plus generous, that's a hell of a good start. So
can we do a quick dive into science and God? Because I want to...
Not quick.
Let's try. So let's try. Can science sufficiently consistently self-actualize humans?
Well, okay.
Because with God, with religion, people find some sort of self-actualization. Can science be a source of self-actualization or morality?
Not the way that we normally construe science. Like, if you look at, let's make that concrete for a minute. When I teach my students my personality class, and we concentrate a fair bit on clinical theories because I'm a clinician, one of the things I make clear to them is that neither medicine nor clinical psychology are sciences. They're variants of engineering. They're attempting to build something. There's an end in mind. There's an ethical end in mind, right? I mean, what you do when you're a clinical psychologist is try to help people make their lives better. Now, you might say, well, you're trying to make them more mentally healthy. But actually, that's a weaker description than that you're trying to make their lives better. Because sometimes, as a clinical psychologist, you see people who are, they're normal in their health, but they would like their lives to be better. There's an up, obviously, and that introduces the ethical realm. And you might be able to use scientific techniques in order to determine which of the strategies you use to try to make your life better are working. But it's not obvious that you can use scientific principles to decide what constitutes better to begin with. That's a big problem. I don't see any evidence that you can.
Well, how about...
Because science excludes morality from its purview at the methodological level.
Well, okay, let's take an example of cancer and science solving suffering by providing solutions to cancer.
Yeah, well, should you devote money to cancer education? That's where the problems start to come, is that you can't make an a priori decision. You can't make an informed decision about where the scientific attention should focus itself. It's not an easy thing to do. At some point, the decisions have to be, they're either arbitrary or they're made by techniques that seem to be outside of the scientific purview. Let me give you an example. So I read this book by an ex-KGB agent who had detailed out some of the extent of the Soviet biological warfare program back in the 1980s. And one of the things the Soviet scientists were trying to do, according to this guy, was to weaponize infectious biological agents, which actually turns out to be harder than we suspected, thank God. And what they were trying to do was cross smallpox with Ebola. And it's because Ebola is like seriously fatal and smallpox is seriously contagious. And so they thought, well, seriously fatal plus seriously contagious, it's like, what could be better than that?
Recipe for disaster.
Right. And so, and you might say, well, is crossing Ebola with smallpox, is seeing whether you can cross Ebola with smallpox a reasonable scientific question, an appropriate scientific question? And purely from the perspective of science, yes. Because science is a generic problem-solving mechanism. Now, you might say, well, no, it's like it's not something any reasonable human being should ever engage in, but that's not the same thing as asking whether or not it's a question within the reasonable purview of science. I mean, the thing about science is that science was designed to be as value-free a methodology as possible. It's designed for that. And so then people say, well, why is there a gap between science and values? It's like, well, because it's built into the methodology. So it looks to me like you need something that's outside of science to direct the ethic. And it seems to me that that's something like stories. Well, it can't come from within science. I don't see how. I mean, partly because you exclude the value.
Isn't the story of the cosmos already enough to get someone excited enough to find some sort of value system from the being born from the stars and that being inspirational?
No, not necessarily, because you can just as easily say, well, you know, here we are in this little dirt ball in the middle, you know, on the outer edge of this galaxy that's rotating, going to rotate pointlessly for the next 250 million years, you know, a couple of dozen billion years before the heat death of the universe. It's like, that's pretty dismal accounting of the utility of life. I mean, you know what I mean? You can take,
we're taking it from
well, you have that entire range of interpretive possibilities from like, isn't life remarkable and wonderful, and to isn't it bloody pointless if you look at it from the wrong temporal perspective.
I think you can find that from science.
Well, yeah, but you can also find the reverse. So that's the problem. I'm not anti-scientific.
Yeah,
but
of course.
I don't see a simple way of solving the problem of the ethical direction of the scientific inquiry. I mean,
what comes to mind maybe as a way to get to that area?
Well, one of the things that I talked about in detail with Sam Harris, and we're going to talk about this some more because it's by no means solved, is the relationship between facts and values. And the old idea, Hume's idea, is you can't derive values from a set of facts. And I think that's sort of right, but I kind of think it's more complicated than Hume thought it was, but I'm not exactly sure why. Because like I made a case earlier about this emergent ethic arising out of iterated games. That kind of looks like a scientific observation about the origin of morality. It's something like that. So it's not like science can't inform your moral decisions, but exactly how that might come about is by no means a straightforward issue. And I mean,
fascinating.
Well, it's also not the case. It is also not self-evident that science has served a beneficial function for human beings. Like, it might be the case. It could be the case. I mean, look, we're pretty comfortable here, and thank God, and that's definitely a consequence of the scientific revolution. But
you know, just highlighted your phone as a major...
Yeah, but one good hydrogen bomb blowing up over North America would set us back about 50,000 years, and that could easily happen. If I was a paranoid dictator, that's certainly what I would do. And I don't know, you guys, most of you guys probably know what would happen if you blow up a hydrogen bomb. I think it's about 150 miles up, something like that. One, you get an electromagnetic pulse, it takes all the electronics out, like all of them. Right. One bomb. And so, like, maybe we'll manage that, but it wouldn't. And, you know, maybe we'll manage that transition to whatever we're going to do next, but I wouldn't count on it. And so, it isn't even necessarily the case that scientific endeavor is a pro-human life process. Back to the rats. So, okay, the rats are pulling on the... You can measure rat motivation by how hard they pull on the spring, let's say. And they're more motivated if they're running away and running towards. But let's go back to play. So you can take juvenile rats who haven't been able to play for a while. Maybe they've been isolated, or maybe they just haven't been able to engage in physical activity, like many school children that you might be thinking about. Neither allowed to play nor allowed to engage in physical activity, and there's a reason I'm telling you that. So anyways, you get one of these little rats and you can measure how hard he'll pull to go out and play, or how many buttons he'll push, you know, and that gives you an indication of his motivation. So anyways, you can see that a play-deprived juvenile rat will fight harder to play than a non-play deprived juvenile rat, and so you can infer that the rat wants to go play. And you know, you do the same measurement with everyone around you. If they want to do something, you're going to poke and prod at them to see what sort of things they're willing to overcome in order to go and do that. You'll object even if you don't really object. It's like, it's a measurement device. And if they're willing to overcome a bunch of your objections, then you think, oh, well, maybe they really want to. And that's another thing to really know. If there's something you want, you need about 5 arguments about why you want it. Because the probability that the person who's opposing you will have 5 arguments about why you shouldn't have it is very low. They just won't have thought it through enough. So the other thing that happens in the future authoring exercise is that you're asked to articulate the reasons for all the goals that come out of your vision of the future. So you're asked, like, why would it be good for you? Why would it be good for your family? Why would it be good for broader society? So that gives you 3 levels of argumentation right there. And if you have it articulated down into detail and it's related to other important goals, then you're a hell of a thing to argue with, because people just aren't that deep, by which I mean they just don't have that many levels of explanation or objection. And it's also really useful in relationship to your own mind, because if you want to do something that's difficult and that requires energy, a lot of different subsystems in your mind are going to throw up objections. It's like, well, maybe that isn't what you should be doing right now. Maybe you should be doing the dishes, or vacuuming, or watching TV, or looking at YouTube. Or if you're really sneaky, when you're trying to do something hard, what your brain does is give you something else hard to do that's not quite as hard, so that you can feel justified in not doing the thing you're supposed to because you're doing something else useful. And if you give in to that temptation, which you often will, then it wins, and because it wins, it gets a little dopamine kick and it grows stronger. Anything you let win, the internal argument, grows, and anything you let be defeated shrinks, because it's punished. It doesn't get to have its way. So that's another thing really to remember. Don't practice what you do not want to become. And because they're neurological circuits. You build those things in there, man, they're not going anywhere. You can build another little machine to inhibit them. That's the best you can do. Once they're in there, you can't get them out. And then the ones you build to inhibit can be taken out by stress, and the old habits will come back up. So you got to be careful what you say and what you do, because you build yourself that way. So anyways, back to the rats. Okay, so the little rat gets to go out there and play. Now imagine one little rat is paired with another rat, but the other little rat is 10% bigger. 10% in juvenile rats is enough to attain permanent dominance. So the 10% bigger rat will win the first wrestling contest, okay? And so that's what happens. And then, so the little rat gets pinned, and maybe they play a bit, and then they're done with it, and so you separate them, then you let them play again. And the next time what happens is that the subordinate rat does the invitation to play. And that's like, you know, like a dog does when it wants to play. But you can recognize that, kind of splays its feet apart, and it looks up and looks interested and sort of dances around. And you can do it with any kid that has a clue, you know, that hasn't been destroyed by adults. If your little 3-year-old kid, or 4-year-olds are better for this, if you go like this, like, they know exactly what's going to happen. You know, they're ready to dart back and forth, and they'll usually smile. And kids love rough and tumble play, which is now basically illegal in all daycares. It seriously is. Kids need it so desperately, because it teaches them the limits of their body and your body, and it teaches them what's painful and what isn't, and it teaches them the dance of play. And without that, they're just little disembodied blobs. Like, they have no finesse. That's what you're checking out when you dance with someone. You're seeing if they have that fluency and facility for mutual reciprocal action embodied in them. And if they're kind of like this, you know, and just have no sense of rhythm and don't pay any attention to you and all of that, you have reason to question whether they actually inhabit their body
and whether they can engage in a mutual interaction, a physical interaction that's going to be reciprocal and mutually satisfying. It's really important to check out. And a lot of that rough and tumble play, even interactions between a child and its mother. If you have a happy mother and a happy infant, and you videotape them and you speed up the videotape, you'll see that they're dancing. So one responds, then the other responds, then the other responds. It might just be with eye gaze and movement and all of that, but there's a dynamic interplay which you don't see with depressed mothers and their infants. So, okay, so back to play. So the little rat who is the subordinate one, he has to do the invitation, and then the big rat can agree to play because he's in the dominant position. But if you pair them repeatedly, and this is really worth thinking about, because see, morality emerges out of repeated interactions. Because you might say, well, if you're only going to interact with someone once, you might as well just take advantage of them and run off. That's what a psychopath does, by the way. And there is room in the environmental niche for psychopaths, but they have to keep moving around, because otherwise people figure out who they are. So they just move around, and they can take advantage of one person, you know, maybe 5 times or 10 times or something, and then the reputation spreads and they got to get the hell out of there. But so it's not a good long-term strategy, unless you can't think of a better one. So anyways, if you repeatedly pair these rats, unless the big rat lets the little rat win at least 30% of the time, the little rat will not ask the big rat to play. And that is, it's a staggering discovery. It's a staggering discovery because you've got the emergence there of a implicit morality, essentially, that's even incarnated in rats, that emerges across multiple play sessions. It's like, yes, exactly. That's exactly what Piaget said about the emergence of morality. It's exactly the same idea at the rat level. So it's a massively, and the fact that there's a circuit, a separate neurophysiological circuit that's actually specialized for that sort of thing is also a big deal. Now, the other thing Panksepp figured out is that if you deprive juvenile rats of the opportunity to engage in rough and tumble play, their prefrontal cortexes don't develop properly, and they become impulsive and restless, and then you can fix them with methylphenidate or Ritalin. And those are the drugs that are used to fix hyperactive kids, most of whom are male. And that's because, well, really, you're going to take your 6-year-old, your 5-year-old, you're going to put them in a desk, you're going to get them to sit there for 6 hours. That's your plan, right? That's a stupid plan. And they're denied the opportunity to engage in play. And that means that their ability to become social is being impaired. It may cause neurological impairment, that's what the rat evidence suggests. And then you suppress that with amphetamines, because amphetamines actually don't activate the play circuit, they activate a different circuit which will suppress the play circuit. So it's it's not very wise. And I'm not going to go off on that tangent because I could tell you why the school systems were set up that way, which I probably will at some point, because it's quite an interesting story in and of itself. And it's the reason all you guys are sitting in desks right now. Somebody laughingly referred to this once as grade 15, which I thought was pretty funny given a look at the bloody place, you know. Oh, hideous.
Time I do a goddamn death dedication. And also want to know what happened to the pictures I was supposed to see this week. It's the last goddamn time I want somebody to use his fucking brain to not come out of a goddamn record that
Que lloren, suelen esa mierda, caballero.
健体な夢の後の何もない世の中じゃそうさ愛しい思いも負けそうになるけど静しかしない目地だらけの頼りない翼でもきっと飛べるさ Oh yeah